Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of the MBE Enterprise Podcast, where we talk about money, business, and entrepreneurship with some of the brightest minds I know. I'm joined on episode 3 here by Matthew Tesvich, founder of OX SOX. You may not have heard of him yet, but trust me, you will soon. Matthew, how are we doing today, my man?
Awesome intro. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here. I'm doing well.
So Matthew and I met actually over the summer at a business startup entrepreneurship national competition. Matthew, I think you should just start by explaining to the audience a little bit about what your company OX SOX is, kind of how you guys got started.
Yeah, so super simple what we do. I'm sure you might have stinky feet. You might know someone with stinky feet. It's a pretty common occurrence, especially through those puberty teenage years. And so that's something I always dealt with. A lot of my baseball teammates dealt with. When you go in the locker room, the first thing you smell are those stinky socks. So the rule always coming to my house growing up was, dude, you got to take off your socks. You got to throw them out before you can join us for dinner, before you can join us on the sofa and watch a movie, whatever the case was. So that was kind of always revolving in the back of my head. So I'll get into the story later, but what we did is we created odorless socks. And so we neutralized that odor-causing bacteria on your feet. And that way you can pursue whatever adventure you're passionate about without that embarrassment.
The own family was getting after you. That's when you know it's got to be bad.
That's
I feel
right.
like some people have this issue and they complain about it. Other people just start a massive company. Like that's a pretty dope way to solve it. So honestly, let's just get right into it. The roots of this actual business, kind of take me back to where it all began. I know you said that there's the things coming home. Everyone has the stinky feet. It surprises me almost that it's not like a widespread thing yet, because it seems like a brilliant idea. So kind of tell us a little bit, Matthew, about just how the beginning started, the actual moment that it took place.
Yeah. So I think to start with that, I think we need to kind of backpedal and look at my story growing up. So as a little kid, I had two dreams. I wanted to be a CEO during the day, and then I wanted to play for the Atlanta Braves at night. And so I thought I could do both. I thought I could get in my car, go from the office to the baseball field, and then go play for the Braves. And I grew up in Atlanta, big Braves fan. So that was kind of, always my dream. So I grew up, was playing baseball. I was on track to play in college. And then I ended up getting sick and having some health issues junior year of high school, which, as you know, Matt, that's one of the biggest times for recruiting for baseball. So I ended up losing 25 pounds practically overnight. It was, I think, a month and a half, 2 months. My stomach was hurting. I wasn't sure what was going on. My velocity had dropped. I was a left-handed pitcher. And so we're doing all these tests. We're trying to figure out what's going on, and we just cannot figure it out. And my weight just kept continuously slipping. So that summer, that was the big recruiting year with travel baseball. I was on a good team, and I comprised some offers, I think solely because I was on such a good team. But, I was not performing to the level that I knew I could be or should be. And so I ended up actually quitting high school baseball that next year because I was trying to figure out what's going on health-wise. I got to get right because my weight kept slipping, kept dropping. So after months of testing, I figured out that I had gotten diagnosed with celiac disease, which meant that you cannot eat gluten. So when I was eating gluten, it was creating this inflammatory reaction in my gut, and I was dropping weight. I couldn't hold anything down. So I took that time to really understand nutrition. Obviously, I went gluten-free, and I put on another 25 pounds of muscles from that really bare bones frame that I had at the beginning of senior year of high school. And so I graduated, I was about 165 pounds, and I really felt good. And so my whole life I had been anticipating playing college baseball. And so I really didn't know what I was going to do. So my family's from New Orleans. My parents went to LSU, so that was always my dream school growing up. And so we thought I was going to go to LSU. And then some scholarship stuff fell through, and so I had to apply to some different schools last minute. So I'm applying to University of Georgia, I'm applying to Kennesaw State, Georgia State, and a lot of this stuff's last minute. And so the first wave of Georgia applicants had already been accepted, and in-state, that's a really tough school to get into. This past year, I think their average GPA was like a 4.2. And so a lot of people refer to it as an Ivy League of the South, which is pretty funny. So long story short, I go to Kennesaw State as just a student. 2 or 3 days on campus, I had like 10 different people ask me, do you play baseball here? And I'm like, no, I don't play baseball. But it kind of got the wheels turning in my head again. I'm like, I feel good. I feel healthy. I missed the game. Let me pick up a baseball and see what I can do. And so I went back to some of my old velocity and training programs. I'd wake up early, go to the gym. I knew how to eat right now. So I ended up putting on another 20 pounds of muscle. I was spending 2.5 hours in the gym. I was throwing all the time, trying to get my arm back in shape. And I wanted to transfer and play college baseball. And so about 2 or 3 months into this process, I was mid 80s, which is okay for a left-handed pitcher. And a lot of the kids down south were throwing a lot harder, and I knew I had something, kind of that baseline of what to compete with. But I ended up meeting a coach down here named Cam Fritz, and I owe my success in baseball to him. He transformed my mechanics and got me into the low 90s within, I think it was 2 or 3 months. So he took me from low to mid 8s to low 9s, and that was something I never dreamed imaginable. It was awesome. And so we put my film out January of 2020 on Twitter, and we started getting some smaller schools reaching out to us, and then bigger schools and bigger schools. And then we started getting small Division I schools, which was new to me. I was super stoked. And then mid-major schools. So I'm getting schools like Hawaii reaching out, and I'm like, whoa, imagine going to Hawaii. And then before long, we started getting Duke and UNC and NC State. And I was getting so excited. And then all of a sudden, COVID hit. And the NCAA put out this recruiting hold and said, hey, if you're recruiting any athletes, we don't know what's going on. The seniors are staying, the freshmen are coming in, so they were running out of money. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. I kept training, and I was praying about it, trying to figure it out. We're like, do I go JUCO? But even the JUCOs ran out of scholarship money. So I had some good JUCO offers, and they were sending kids to big schools to the draft. But after praying about it, my family and I just didn't feel right. And so I ended up transferring to University of Georgia with the intention to walk on. We were going to do a private tryout. A lot of the kids I had played with growing up in travel ball in high school, they played at University of Georgia. Cam had some connections to the coaching staff. The coaching staff always sent guys into where I was training at. So we felt like it would be a good fit. It was in the SEC. And so right before that private tryout, my plan was to hit 100 miles an hour. And so I didn't hit 100 miles an hour, but that was the goal, right? Got to set something aspirational. And so a few weeks before that private tryout, I'm throwing a bullpen, and my shoulder just felt fatigued. I was throwing, and it just had this weak feeling in it. And I was throwing the ball high, and then I would spike it. And Cam's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, we got scouts out here. You're throwing with big leaguers. Like, what is going on? I'm like, dude, my arm just doesn't feel right. He's like, take a week off. And it still felt so fatigued. I didn't know what was going on. I started getting numbness and tingling through my fingers. And long story short, I got an MRIs and found out that I had torn and separated my labrum of my throwing shoulder. I had torn my UCL, which you hear Tommy John surgery, that's what that is. And I had torn my labrum on my opposite side, 12-4, 12-5. So 3 injuries. And I knew, I'm like, God's closing the door here. If I had gotten back-to-back surgeries, it would have been 18 months minimum recovery time. And so I'm like, we got to pivot to something else. So that's where we go into entrepreneurship. So what's my other dream? Being a CEO. And so literally it was a God thing, in my opinion. It was a couple days after I found out the MRI results. My roommate came home with this towel that lets you wash your hands without soap. And it was this weird looking, feminine looking towel that you probably wouldn't see in most college guys' apartments or houses. And I go, Dylan, dude, what is this thing? Like, you put it on our oven. What the heck is this? He's like, dude, my aunt helped make this thing at the University of Tennessee. You won't believe what it does. I said, what does it do? He goes, you can cut raw chicken, wipe your hands on the towel, and they'll be clean. And I said, there's no way. And he goes, no, really, really. And so I started doing research, and he was right. And the first thing that came to the back of my head was my feet, because I had just had a conversation with my dad about, dude, you need to throw away your socks and get some more because your feet smell so bad. And so I started putting two and two together, and I was like, if this can kill the raw bacteria from chicken, or excuse me, the raw chicken bacteria, I wonder if this can kill the odor-causing bacteria in your feet. And so after 18 months of R&D, we finally got a working pair of OX SOX, and they neutralize foot odor.
That's amazing, Matthew. There's a ton to unpack right there. First of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with baseball at all, I mean, the highlight, he's mentioning some top tier D1 schools for baseball right there. Like this, we're talking low 90s as a lefty. That's extremely legitimate, like MLB chances, right? There's guys, it's not it's 1 in 1,000,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000 of guys who actually throw that hard, or people who actually on the planet throw that hard from the left side. Like that is, we're talking very legitimate stuff. So, I mean, to be able to bounce back from that and have the mentality that you did, I think is a testament to your mentality as a whole, because I don't think a lot of people would even realize what that takes. I certainly wouldn't know what it takes. I mean, I played Division II college baseball, and thinking about having that just taken away from you, and the fact that COVID kind of contributed to some of the recruiting issues that you had in a way, and just everything with that. You mentioned you're clearly a firm believer in God, and that this was His plan for you, because, yeah, like you said, there's some aspects there that you just kind of have to kind of just tip your hat and say, all right, like this is clearly not the route that you necessarily want from me right now, but this is what I'm gonna take, and this is what I'm gonna go on. And it seems like you've accepted that extremely well for how difficult that would be. A lot of people may not realize that. Moving forward with OX SOX, aside from just the baseball aspect, what was that R&D process like? You mentioned 18 months of R&D. I feel like a lot of people don't nowadays. I think services are almost becoming bigger than products. And I say this inventions wise because I feel like the larger companies nowadays, they just naturally and always probably have had more access to R&D and other things that it takes to come up with breaking, cutting edge, innovative products. Whereas I feel like a lot of smaller entrepreneurs like to attack it from the service angle. So the fact that this is a product-based company is something that I found interesting, and kind of, if you could describe that 18 months of R&D, because that's no short time frame for you to stick it out. There's a lot of opportunity to give up during that period, Matthew. So if you'd want to touch on that for me.
Yeah. So I started, it was very similar to the Sarah Blakely story with Spanx. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but she would call manufacturers and they say, "Who are you?" And she'd say, "I'm Sarah Blakely." And they're like, "We don't know who you are. Who are you with?" And she'd go, "I'm with Sarah Blakely." And they would just hang up on her because they didn't know who it was. It was very similar. Ironically, I just listened to that podcast before this kind of idea spurred on, but I'd call these U.S. manufacturers, and in North Carolina is where the hub of socks and hosiery are created. So I was calling all these different manufacturers, and they'd not answer the phone. I'd leave messages, I'd shoot them emails, and I wasn't getting any responses. So I ended up reaching out to over 100 different manufacturers. I got over 50 samples made, and that R&D process was really me going and wearing these socks, going for a run, going to the gym, going to play football with friends or something like that. And then I tried to wear them again the next day and see if they stunk. And most of the time they did. And so it was kind of that process of rinse and repeat, fine tuning things. I'd have this kind of mental recipe in my head of what I wanted in the socks. And then some manufacturers would say, "We can't do that," or "Dude, you're crazy. This is never going to work." But similar to Edison with the light bulb, I knew every failure was one step closer to reality and success. And so that was my mindset. And I knew we were onto something with this. So I was excited. I was hungry. And after 18 months, I found a pair that worked for me. I wore it for a week. It didn't stink. And so to validate that, I got some more samples made, and I ended up shipping them to some of my athlete buddies at Clemson and Georgia Tech. And I'd say, "Hey, I want you to take this through your stinkiest practice, get them wet, and I want you to let me know if it stinks." And so they'd wear it. They'd give it to their teammates who had stinky feet, and they'd call me back a week later and say, "Dude, you've got something. My teammates all want one. This is the most comfortable sock I've ever worn." So that was an added benefit that I hadn't even thought about, which was really exciting. And they were all rocking it. So we had Clemson athletes wearing them, Georgia Tech athletes wearing them, and it was really exciting. So from there, we put in that first PO, that first purchase order, and we were off to the races.
What was the process like when you'd get a new set, a new pair shipped to you, and then you would have to try them on, try it for a week, and then it would fail? What was that kind of that failure? I know you didn't view it as failure, and I love that Thomas Edison quote. I brought that up, I think maybe in both of the previous episodes so far. So that's just awesome. But what was that? How did that failure play a role? And was there ever times where you were on the brink of giving up, or is this just something that you're just bound and determined, like, it's going to work?
Yeah. So there were different things, like, for example, perforating the top of the sock, trying to create it more, create more airflow. I figured that might be something that would help. But in reality, it didn't, because our material wasn't able to be as effective. And the top of the foot is a part of the foot that sweats a lot. There's 3 key regions. And so I just had this massive Excel sheet, and I was taking notes and really trying to dissect the sock as much as I could, trying to understand it. And when it comes to failure, after about a year of doing the R&D, I started slowing down, and I was kind of questioning, is this something I really want to do? Is this an idea that's really valid? And I didn't fully stop, but I slowed things down. And I ended up talking to my family, and they were like, dude, like, you created something where we don't have to tell you to throw away your socks anymore. You can sit with us at dinner and we're not complaining. It's astounding. Like, you have to run with this. And around that time, I started seeing some different advertisements and things for odorless or like no stink clothing. And so I'm like, okay, the market's starting to adopt this technology. We need to move quickly. And so I think that really sparked me. And then that natural athlete competitive hunger in me was like, all right, it's time to take them on.
So you mentioned that athletic competitive nature. How big of a role do you think that plays overall in your mindset going forward as how parallel is the process of pitching on the mound and running an organization, bootstrapping an organization as a CEO, as a founder?
That's a really, really good question. And I don't think a lot of people ask that. So we talked about it in Minnesota, but I think especially in these pitch circuits and stuff, there's so many kids that are academic focused. There's some people who, they've got that entrepreneurial spirit about them, but there's a lot of people too who have that academic spirit, and they're used to the textbook and they're doing things the textbook way. And I think entrepreneurship is really a testament to breaking out the confines of the rules and doing it your own way. And so when we're in these pitch circuits and stuff, you see these academic kids, and like, from an academic perspective, they're intimidating. But you and I, you faced 90-mile-an-hour pitching. I've faced, guys who are in the MLB now, and you got to be a bulldog on the mound, or you got to be a bulldog in the box and figure out, how do I turn it on, lock in, and, make contact, get a hit, or how do I throw it by this guy and, beat him? And so I think that comes out, that instinct. And to me, I owe so much to sports, because had I not played baseball, especially at that level, I don't think I'd be where I am today.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. It's incredibly powerful and very true. I mean, I say this all the time, but entrepreneurship is literally a synonym for problem solving. And that is life. All of life is just finding a way. Things aren't going to go right constantly. You have to find a way to get over it, find a way to figure out, take the next step, make the best move on the chessboard, as many would say. That's that sort of thing. And I think sports, athletics in general, it works beautifully in the business world, because it does the same thing. It teaches you how to do that. And there are no excuses. You have to find a way. You either get it done or you don't. So I do think that's extremely beneficial. And I would say it has been extremely beneficial for myself as well. Okay, so moving on from the R&D process of OX SOX, what was kind of the next steps you took forward after you found that winning product that you're like, okay, this is the blend combination, this is the material we're going to use? What's kind of moving forward from there, and then tying into kind of where you're at now with it?
So after the R&D, our lead time, I think, was 3 or 4 months. And so I was starting to do sock smell test on social media, on TikTok specifically. And so I had built up this personal following, and so I felt that I started to understand the algorithm. And so I had a buddy named Leon who really helped kind of teach me a lot of the intricacies of TikTok. And he was doing interviews in downtown Athens, which is where University of Georgia is. So he'd go downtown at night and have a wheel and spin it and those kind of things. And so I met with him, and he's like, dude, let's do it for socks. And so that's what I started doing. I'd have a sock that was normal that had been worn for a day, and I'd have an OX SOX, one of our samples, that had been worn for a week. And I'd go up to girls and guys, and I'd ask them some trivia questions. And then I'd say, all right, to break the tie, you got to guess which sock's been worn longer. And a lot of people started loving those videos. And so people started recognizing it around campus, word of mouth spread, and we started to generate a little bit of buzz. So fast forward 3-4 months, we get a ton of socks delivered, and now I got to figure out how to sell this stuff, right? And so a lot of my friends are doing paid media already, a lot of the kids in the entrepreneurship program. And so I started asking myself, how do we get as many eyeballs as we can on these socks without paying? And so I instantly thought the news. I was like, we have these funny videos that we can show, like, this works. We got validation. And then, how do we got a unique product. It's a problem solver. How do we reach out? How do we get on these news sites? So I just started sending emails. And once you get one, all the dominoes start to fall. So we started getting news, more news, more news. And the cool thing about the news is once you get one, it leads to, potentially a national. Like you get a local press and it leads to national because a lot of times they're a part of a bigger chain. So for example, I got into the Athens Banner Herald, and this was right around the time of Black Friday and Thanksgiving. So I was excited about that, did that interview. And then 2 days later, I wake up. I normally get up early, so it's 5:30, 6 in the morning, and we had already gotten like 15 orders. I was like, what is going on? So I start emailing customers. I don't hear back because it's Black Friday. And finally, at the end of the day, we had over, I think, 300 or 400 orders, which is crazy. We were 2 days into launch. And finally, one of the customers emailed me back, and she sent me a picture of the newspaper, and we were on the front cover of USA Today on Black Friday. And so for 2, 3, 4 straight days, we had just crazy amounts of orders. And I ended up having to miss like 7 or 10 days of school just to try to catch up with all this stuff. It was wild. And this is the time of finals and final projects and all. And I'm in my senior year. So things are just going nuts. And to myself, I'm like, man, business is so easy. I'm so excited. And obviously Q4 is the best time for retail. And things started to trickle down from there and kind of normalize and stabilize out. But it was a really, really exciting time. And we got to move through a lot of inventory.
That's incredible, actually. Holy cow. I mentioned to you that I watched one of your podcast episodes prior to get a little bit of background info, but I did not know that it blew up. Like, did you run out? You didn't run out of stock right away, did you? How many was in your initial stock again?
So we had 10,000 pairs, and actually several of our SKUs completely ran out. So I think within a week and a half, we had run out of several of our different SKUs. So we're on the phone with the manufacturer, like, we got to get more. And so that was fun too. I got to wear a lot of hats during that time.
For sure. And that's, once again, just a testament to your overall mentality as a whole. And I mean, the perseverance to just, I think a lot of people would thinking of to just like contact news channels nowadays, that almost seems that like that would be so overlooked in the world of digital media and digital marketing. And going back to those TikTok videos, you said you'd grown a following on your personal account, and it's obviously still pretty big today. Do you have any tips for anyone listening, kind of how you found to work TikTok in particular, or any other social media platforms for your digital marketing of OX SOX?
Yeah, so I can't take credit for it. Like I said, Leon, I think he's at 3 or 4 million followers. He's leon.ond on TikTok and Instagram, I believe. And then some buddies from high school have built a following of over 10 million, and they just rebranded. I'm not quite sure what their name is, but I owe it to them. They really taught me the ins and outs, and they explained having to transition with the different screens, that hook at the beginning. So that first 1 to 2 seconds is so important to capture your audience. And it's got to be something engaging, right? You got to spark that curiosity, and you want to drag them on through the whole video. So you're constantly entertaining, you're constantly leaving them curious, and then boom, you hit them with that fact at the end that they were really hooked on the line to try to see.
One thing I feel like I've learned from both a little bit of personal experience, but also just general research on my own, has been, it seems like all the platforms, everyone wants to find a special formula for it. But I think it was Mr. Beast talking in a video. You don't know who that is. I mean, he's got like 300 million combined, like 5% of the globe basically is subscribed to him. So he would know what he was talking about. And he basically just said, anytime you use the word algorithm, just replace it with audience. Like, oh, the algorithm didn't like that video. No, the audience just didn't like your video. He's like, if people engage, people watch the content, people interact with the content, it's going to get pushed, right? It's going to get views, it's going to get likes, it's going to get comments. So I think everyone kind of likes to try and look for the cheat code or, the hack. And I kind of was asking that question with that intent, but if you just make engaging videos, like you said, you have to hook them for those first couple seconds. That's huge. But you think of anything like a joke is going to have a hook. Anything like movies, right? They want to tie you in. TV series, they want to get you hooked right away. It's the same as anything. Any digital media that you're consuming is going to have that hook. It's going to have the suspense point, and then you're going to hit them with the punchline at the end or the call to action or whatever it may be. So really, in the grand scheme of things, they're kind of similar, at least from what I've learned. You also mentioned that you would ask trivia questions before you would ask the people whether they could tell the difference in the socks. One thing that was interesting to me when I saw that, and I have watched some of your videos, why was it your idea or was it their idea to implement those trivia questions at the beginning? Because to me, I would think that just asking them that upfront question I'd maybe find that interesting, but obviously you found that, the trivia kind of builds into that suspense, or kind of take me through that process of just how that was implemented, I guess.
There wasn't a whole lot of thought that went into the trivia. There's several Instagram and TikTok influencers that'll go in that corner down there in downtown Athens on the weekends, and they're all doing trivia as well. So I just plugged in with those guys, made friends with them. I ended up doing my own set of trivia, my own little niche. And then the other thing too is a lot of the girls especially did not want to try to smell socks. And so if you say, do you want to play trivia? They're a lot more likely to say yes. Same thing for guys. They're a lot more likely to say yes than, oh, do you want to smell these dirty socks?
That's very true. That's very true. Something I wouldn't have thought of until I guess I walked on the street and asked people. And that is interesting. It plays into the just human psychology in general, right? Of like, oh, okay, we'll ask a couple trivia questions. Okay, this person's hesitant to do this. Okay, then maybe they're tied. Then you drop the question of, oh, winner gets this. So now it's like, oh, I don't really want to smell these, but the person I'm standing next to is probably my friend. Like, they're going to beat me if I don't. So I guess I will. Like, that's honestly interesting. And maybe that wasn't even thought of. But looking back, it's crazy how effective that must have been with those implementations. And so moving forward a little bit, Matthew, we've kind of got the story. We talked about the marketing aspect a little bit. What I want to know now is work-life balance. How do you, and student work-life balance, I mean, at this time, for you, especially at that time, I should say, how were you able to balance all that? And how do you think your mentality, what's your mentality like? And how does it play a role in balancing all that? Because like you mentioned, you had a ton of stuff going on and it all was needed to get done quickly.
When I was younger, and I think up until close to my graduation at UGA, I was always the yes man. Every single day of the week, I was doing something. And my dad had always preached this to me growing up. And he said, everything that you say yes to, you're saying no to something else. And so I went from becoming that yes man to that no man. And I would focus on trying to grow a business in that last year. And I would say no to a lot of events so that way I could focus on what I wanted to do. Because yes, it was great to hang out with friends. Yes, it was great to do these social events. But in the long term, that wasn't going to get me to where I wanted to go. And so I really think that there's three big pillars in life. I think there's that social aspect. I think there's that physical aspect. And I think there's that spiritual aspect. And so spiritually, I'm a Christian. I attribute a lot to my faith. That's important to me. And so I think, constantly relying on God and knowing that he's in full control, I think that takes a lot of the anxieties and a lot of the pressures off, especially with entrepreneurship and business and all those stressors. Physically, I was training, and similar to, I'm sure you were training at such a high level with high school, college athletics that once you kind of take that foot off the gas, it's not quite the same. So I find myself still training at a very similar intensity and intense rate when I'm in the gym or when I'm running. Because if I do anything else, I feel like I'm just not at that same baseline that I was before. So that helps. That gets rid of a lot of that mental fog. And I really feel like I'm, callousing my body, preparing myself for the day. I'll get up before 5 a.m. every day, go to the gym, and that's, you got to get the hardest part of your day done with first. And so that's what I always look forward to. I get up, get out of bed, and get to it. And then on that social aspect, I think it's really important to have friends and people you're communicating with, especially that think similarly to you. And, at Georgia, for example, there's 30,000 people. And so there's a ton of people to network with and be social with. And I met a lot of really good people there. And then I met some of my closest friends there as well who share, the same beliefs, spiritually, morally, entrepreneurship wise. And a lot of them were former athletes as well. And so I really met a good group of people there. And I think having us push each other really just created a good, healthy environment. But with the work-life balance, I'm a big believer, and I think Alex Hormozy says this. And are you
I
a
was
big
going to
Hormozy
bring
guy?
him up when you mentioned that stuff. I love Hormozy's content, but
Yeah,
go ahead.
He's got some good stuff. I'm a big believer that there's different seasons of life and that you don't always need to be balanced at all times. I think there's such a push right now to be balanced and have all these things, and I think that's great. But for me personally, I think to be great, you have to you cannot perform at the same level that an average person does. Because if you do the average thing and you do the same thing that everybody else is, you're going to become like everybody else. You have to get exceptionally lucky. But if you put in the work and you put in the work and you put in the work and you're waking up before everybody else and you're staying after everybody else and you're focused and you're staying off social media and you're staying away from the alcohol and the drugs and all the fun, free dopamine that everybody else is going after, if you stay locked in, you create that gap of separation. And again, I got to take this from Hormozy. It's not one silver bullet. It's 100 golden BBs.
I love that. And one other thing I have to ask, you mentioned callousing the mind. Surely that didn't come from David Goggins or anything like that, did it?
I love those Navy SEAL podcasts. That one probably came from Jocko or Goggins. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Jocko, Goggins, love them all. But yeah, going back to what you said with Hormozy there, I think creating that separation like you talked about and putting in the work consistently allows you with opportunities like to get lucky. I think people are always worried about, well, I'm not lucky. Like luck 100% is involved, but I believe personally that you can also put yourself in a position to get lucky. Like you can put yourself in optimal situations and optimal positions that then when luck does strike down on that spot, you're there and you're ready to take advantage of it in a way. Like, because I just think that's a smart way to look at it, because then you're kind of in control of it as well. The harder you work, well, the more lucky I will get. And maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But at the end of the day, that's where the spirituality aspect you mentioned comes in, and just having faith that, everything will work out. You mentioned there's a lot to unpack there. Again, you mentioned that you get up early, essentially, I don't want to say essentially every day, if it is every day, in fact, but you certainly have days, I think everyone does, you certainly have days where it's harder than others to get up in the morning and harder than others to get after it right away, even though you have to, and you have to have that discipline, not just the motivation to get it done. How do you do that consistently? I think a lot of people, that's a common question all the time, is how people are able to do that. And they see people like David Goggins, the ultra extreme, I would say. But they see others that are doing that. And then to see someone like yourself, a young man who's clearly doing it, getting it done, and just no excuses, no BS, getting after it. How do you consistently do that every day? I think you could be a really good inspiration to people out there because of your ability to stay disciplined and with all of this going on.
I think you have to ask yourself how bad you want it. When I was in middle school and early high school, I tried to wake up early, and I'd wake up early maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and then I'd let myself slack the rest of the week. And I realized that without consistency, it really is doing nothing for you. It's like going to the gym and eating a hamburger and drinking a milkshake right afterwards. And so I started asking myself, how bad do I want it? And it just takes one day where you miss an important business call because you slept in. In my case, I was throwing with one of the Braves minor league guys, and I'd missed my alarm clock, and I looked at my phone. I woke up, and he had called me, I think 3 or 4 times, and he said, all right, I'm leaving. And we were supposed to throw that morning at 7 a.m., and I had slept till 7:30 or 8, and I vowed to myself, this will never happen again. And so I think it just boils down to how bad do you want it, if you're getting up before 5 and the average person's getting up at 7, 8 o'clock, you get another 2 or 3 hours of work than they do. And the other thing too is it's a lot easier to stay up late than it is to wake up early. And so you're out working that person, you're more creative in the morning. It boils down to how bad do you want it.
How do you balance that out? Do you go to bed earlier as well? Because I would say sleep is obviously also a very important factor in your overall health and cognitive function, especially when you're trying to run a startup company. So some people would hear that maybe and think that they would need to sacrifice sleep if they want to also stay up late. Is that something that you do, or do you go to bed earlier because of that to set yourself up for that next day of work?
So I've shifted my mindset on this. I used to be a big believer in not sleeping a lot, and I used to get 4 or 5 hours a night. And I had gotten accustomed to that and used to that. And there'd be one day at the end of the week where I'd crash and kind of get my 8 hours again. And then I had a roommate in school, the same one with the towel, and he's a professional athlete. And he was telling me, he's like, dude, sleep is so important. And he slowly chipped away at me. And so now I focus and prioritize getting 7 or 8 hours. So I'll go to bed at 9. I try to go to bed 9, 9:30, 10 every night. That way I can get those 8 hours. But again, if I cannot get that, you still got to stay disciplined on the back end and get up early.
I love that. Love that. Yeah. And I would also agree that, someone, maybe you could just call me soft for this, but I do think I am a firm believer that sleep is really important. I've listened to, I know I mentioned the Huberman podcast to you earlier, neuroscience, neurobiologist, and he has guest Matthew Walker on. I think actually just a couple days ago he was on again, and he's kind of the sleep expert of the digital world anyway that you see on Instagram or social media. And the things he mentions, sleep is the closest thing that humans have to a performance enhancing drug that's legal, athletes in the sense anyway, that's legal for them. And then you also, that ties into cognitive function, obviously, and not just physical ability as well. So I'm glad you're getting 7 to 8 hours now, as opposed to just 4 to 5 grinding. But I do respect the 4 to 5 hour grinding mindset, because once again, not everyone has that. And it's true. You're trying to separate yourself from others, and doing that consistently is going to separate yourself from others and set you up to be lucky in the future. So it's all incredible, man. One thing too, you mentioned that sleeping in incident when you were going to play catch with the Braves. Pitcher, right? I believe. Yeah. Would you consider that one of your biggest failures, one of your biggest mistakes, or what's kind of the biggest, perhaps life mistake, but also business mistake that you've made? And how did that maybe springboard you forward for success later on after you learned from it?
I think the two biggest ones that come to my head are both baseball related. And that one of oversleeping and missing throwing, I felt so terrible about myself. Granted, I had stayed up late that night before, but there's no excuse. I had an opportunity to throw with this guy who was moving up the minor league ranks. He was throwing over 100 miles an hour. I had so much to learn. We were training together, and so I had let him down. And so, like I said, I vowed to myself that I will never, ever do this again. So my alarm then went to the other side of my room. Don't hit snooze. I'm up early every morning, and now it's a practice to almost naturally wake up. I'm used to getting up early. The other big one was we talked about COVID. And so right before COVID hit and shut down all the NCAA recruiting stuff, I just started getting talked to by some of these bigger schools, some of these Power 5 ACC schools. And I told you LSU was my dream school growing up because my parents went there. We had met the LSU recruiting coordinator at one of my tournaments in high school, and I had gotten his cell phone number. And I never had the cojones to call him. And that's one of my biggest regrets today. I don't think necessarily the Sox would have happened if I had ended up playing at LSU. Who knows what would happen there? And, I got hurt in the long run. So ultimately God's plan, lived true. But I think that's one of my biggest regrets and at least biggest learning lessons is I had the recruiting coordinator's phone number and I never even gave him a call.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to look back on it and think, what was I doing? But I think fear of what might happen, I think that's a common one. It's certainly not just you in that situation. And I'm just guessing here, right? But maybe that just nerve-wracking fear aspect of like, what's he going to say? What if they say no? Sometimes, once again, I don't know if this was the case, but in my own experience, sometimes you're worried about what the answer might be. So you'd rather just not hear it at all, right? If you just don't ever ask the question, you can't ever get told the answer. And if you're worried about what that answer is going to be, it probably just sits better in your mind of you can go forward and look back on it and say, oh, well, I don't know, maybe it would have worked out, or maybe this, or maybe that. Where if you ask the question, I love the quote, everything you ever wanted is on the other side of fear, right? I love that. And if you ask the question, you might get the answer you don't want to hear, but you might get the answer you really do want to hear. And if you really do care about it, it really is something that's important to you, then you should always ask that question. Because I love just living with no regrets, and not living with no regrets as in, like, I talked about this previously too, that the whole idea of YOLO, right? I said I love YOLO, but not for the reason that society loves YOLO. I love YOLO because you only live once. Like, make good use of it. You got one shot to be who you want to be and do what you want to do and live to your full potential. I mean, I said the same thing, and most people are just like, YOLO, it's just a shot to do whatever and do something dumb, do something that's not going to benefit you. And it's kind of short-term versus long-term thinking as well, and just thinking ahead to what's really going to benefit you in the long run. And tying that back to what I was saying with that fear of finding it out, you never want to look back and wonder what if, right? You'd rather have that solid no. At the time, it might be hard, but you truly never want to look back and just wonder. So I can see, obviously, you learn from that now, I would guess, and chosen to, never let that happen again, or never do that again. But I think that is, a really, really powerful thing to know going forward, because just sometimes just asking the question is the hardest battle there is. What about in business, particularly, maybe more recently? Have you had a specific failure that really has been detrimental at all, or how have you bounced back from it more recently outside of baseball?
I think a lot of these lessons I've learned in baseball, I talked about athletics really translating to other parts of my lives. I learned the skill of being coachable in baseball. I saw a lot of my teammates weren't willing to listen. They thought they knew everything, and they would tell somebody who had won a World Series in the MLB that the kid acted like they knew more than he did. And that was just always astounding to me. And so that instilled that coachability into me. And so one of the big things that I have tried to do and been mindful of is getting a good team of mentors around me. And so Bob Pinkney, who was the founder and CEO of EvoShield before they got acquired by Wilson, and some of the ex-president of Spanx, I've been blessed to have some really, really good mentors that I've met through pitch competitions and in the Atlanta area. And so I bounce these questions off of them to shorten the learning curve, but also try to avoid these big mistakes. Because especially as a small company, one big mistake, one big wave can wipe you out. And so I owe a lot of this to them to, move over and let the train come instead of trying to face it head on.
And what would you say to aspiring entrepreneurs? I know you just touched on your experience with mentorship. How important would you really say that is to them? Or what would you say to a young entrepreneur who isn't really sure if they need a mentor or if they want a team of mentors around them? They kind of they're confident in their abilities, because you should be confident in your abilities too, right? They're confident in their abilities and they don't really think they need a mentor. What would you tell that person if you were in a conversation with them?
I think it's easy to empathize, because when I was younger, I thought I knew everything, and I thought I knew everything about business, and I felt like I could just take on the world. And I feel like this is pretty cliche, but as I've gotten older, and I'm only 22 now, I feel like there's so much stuff finding out that I don't know. I went from being almost the top dog in college because, you go through your 4 years and now you know everything. And then you get plugged into bigger circles with people who have 20, 25, 30 years of wisdom on you. And then you feel like that little guy again. And so I would encourage you to get around people who have strengths and your weaknesses, but almost more specifically have strengths where your strengths are. Because everybody wants to focus on being well-rounded and strengthening your weaknesses. But the people who are exceptional, the people who are great, are the ones who strengthen their strengths, because you create that gap of separation. And so I would highly encourage mentorship. It's been one of the most fantastic things, and I owe so much to my mentors.
Yeah, I think having a well-rounded grasp of life, but also business, is important in a sense. But like you mentioned, doubling down on your strengths is what really separates not just being good or even great at something, but really being absolutely exceptional at it and becoming the top tier, business, the top tier founder that you eventually want to become. And if you're someone who has those aspirations, I think that is something. Once again, I will say this on every episode. I'm 22 years old. I'm young, dumb, stupid. Don't listen to anything I say, right? But I do think that is something that is extremely beneficial to double down on your strengths. And really, like you said, it's all about degree of separation and separating yourself from the rest of the pack. And that doesn't mean surrounding yourself with people that you're already much better than, right? Like you said, you surround yourself with some of the best people you can essentially get with, right? The best mentors, the best connections you have is who you want to be around. You never want to be the smartest person in the room. And if you're able to do that and then also grind on top of it, then you'll be able to eventually separate yourself from that pack. And you want to be in the top 1% of the top 1%. And I think that's awesome. And everything you've said so far has been great, Matthew. What would you say to that entrepreneur, not just about mentorship, but an entrepreneur who's afraid to get started? Maybe they have a good idea, but fear failure or fear the criticism that might come of them, of their peers or maybe their friends, their closest friends. What would you say to that person that's just kind of afraid of the failure aspect of entrepreneurship?
Thomas Edison, we talk about the light bulb. Every time that you fail, you have a learning, and that's almost more valuable in a success because you understand which direction not to go and you're able to cut it off. And so if you can fail fast, I really think that's almost more important. So that's a big thing. And just taking that leap. I was somebody who, especially in high school, talked. I wanted to do crypto. I wanted to do Forex. I wanted to trade stocks. I wanted to do real estate. I wanted to do drop shipping. I wanted to do all these different things. But it was until I actually focused on one and actually took that shot and actually put that investment into starting a business that something actually happened. And so you just have to take that first step because that's really the hardest part. And if we were in a big field and you're trying to get to a tree a mile away, if you keep your line of vision, you can move and pivot and you can step around branches. But if you're just looking down, you don't know what direction you're going. So you got to take that first step and just know the direction, know the general direction, and you'll figure it out along the way. You don't have to have it all figured out.
Wow, I'd never heard that field analogy before. I really like that one. Honestly, that it's really well said, and just keeping your eyes on the prize, as they would say, right, is extremely important. But also not pivoting. I listened to a thing, not pivoting when you shouldn't be pivoting. Like, right, you have to know when to pivot. I listened to, I believe it was Alex Hormozy talking about this too, and he says everyone they chase the dopamine hit of a new idea, right? They go from, I'm going to butcher how eloquently he put this, but they essentially they have an idea, they get the dopamine rush of they're overly optimistic, right? Then they hit a roadblock and they become overly pessimistic and they're like, this will never work out. And then they pivot to new idea because they're like, oh, there's a new idea. This is going to be amazing. I'm going to get this, you get this big dopamine rush again. And you're excited about a new thing until you hit the first roadblock, maybe the second one this time. And then you'll be like, oh, this will never work and I'm going to quit on it. Now I'll find the next thing because, the next big thing is here. When in reality, if you never double down on your strengths, never build your strengths in the first place, the skills required to be good at anything, you're just never going to succeed. And I'm saying this as someone who I am by no means extremely successful, but you just have to know that that's one of the things that it's so easy to fall into that trap. And I have done it myself so many times. And up until recently, I was kind of the same way of like, no, I'm drawing the line right here. Like, this is what I'm doing now. And that's it. I'm not pivoting again. If I pivot again, it's going to be into a 9-to-5 job that I know I don't want to do. So it's done, like no more pivoting, right? Because it's just short-term gratification. You have to be looking, thinking with that long-term mindset. And then eventually just trusting in the fact that you will get there. Like if you put in the work and you truly grind, you will get there. You know what I mean? And so I think that's another just extremely good point you bring up. We talked about mentorship, Matthew. I think we've talked about a lot of stuff so far. I love that you mentioned, wrapping back to earlier, we talked about physical health and how that affects your cognitive function and just that ability as a whole. I think that's another big point that a lot of people may overlook too. Like you can be grinding at a computer for 16 hours a day, but if your physical health is in slow decline, you're not even going to notice maybe that your cognitive abilities are slipping a little bit, right? Or your energy levels are slipping a little bit. Drinking water, staying hydrated, all that good stuff, staying physically fit ties, maybe not as much as the work ethic itself, but it also ties into the grinding too and keeping yourself sharp when you're starting a business. I have two more questions for you for sure, Matthew. The first one being, I know you mentioned you had two goals as a kid. One of them was to play professional baseball, and the other one was to be a CEO. Well, technically, I don't think by the book you're considered a CEO until you have like X amount of employees. I think like technically, you kind of are already, right? But looking at it now, what would you say the playing MLB baseball equivalent is for you in business? Where are you trying to get in the next 5 to 10 years? What's kind of your, I hate saying end goal. So not end goal because there never is an end goal. You always want to be improving, but what's kind of the equivalent for you being in the MLB? What's a more specific goal that you have for business analogy for me?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think becoming a household brand, something where we're helping people. The biggest takeaway that I had after getting hurt from baseball was everything that I was doing was self-glorifying. I wanted to play college baseball ultimately because I wanted to be the big guy on campus. I wanted to play in the MLB so everybody knew my name. And after I got the injury and got that all taken away from me and started doing the Sox, I realized that I stopped living for myself and I started to live to help others. And so I started getting emails in like, my daughter was going to quit dance because she was getting made fun of. Or my daughter was going to quit cheer because she was getting made fun of. And she started wearing your socks. And now nobody comments on the foot odor anymore. She doesn't have to stick her shoes outside the classroom or outside the dance studio. And that's the kind of stuff where I'm really making an impact on somebody else's life. And it feels so good. And if we can become a household brand and help these people and give a solution that people don't know exists, because it really is a problem. 1 out of every 6 people in the US suffer from this. And that's just extreme foot odor. So if we really can provide this solution and become a household brand, that's the MLB equivalent. That's the All-Star equivalent, the Hall of Fame equivalent.
Awesome. Now, one thing that made me think of actually is, so the ideation process for you, I feel like was kind of straightforward, as in like you personally had this issue that you wanted to solve, and then you found a way to solve it. Say you were starting, pretend OX SOX doesn't exist, right? Say you were starting a new company, but you still have that entrepreneurial spirit in you, right? How would you go about attacking the ideation process and the actual coming up with the idea and knowing that this is something I want to move forward with, right? Because I think there's a fine line. And one thing I just talked about earlier with pivoting so often that you never actually get anywhere with anything. Well, I think one of the fears that people have, or at least I did, was what if this business actually does suck, right? Like, what if I actually do need to pivot? Like, what if this idea isn't good? How would you go about kind of finding the next big idea that you would think of? Would it be consulting people? Would it be just refreshing the AI algorithms to spit you out more and more ideas until you finally had one that clicked? Like, how would you go about the ideation process if you were starting from square one today?
My mind is always thinking about solutions. And so I always write down in journal things where I'm like, oh, this is a problem that I think we can come up with a solution to. So I've kind of always got these things in my head, like, I wonder if this would work. If I were to do it over again, I think instead of trying to order socks ahead of time, now I know people have stinky feet, so that really is not necessarily as applicable. But if, let's say, we don't know if people would buy the socks, I may try to do pre-orders and see if I can sell people at farmers markets and things like that, and see if this is something that's really tangible that people are willing to pay for. So if I were to do it over again, I think that's what I would do is see if it's really something that is wanted in the market. And if it is, you can grow and scale, and you can fund your business through pre-orders.
Off the topic of socks, have you ever had any other entrepreneurial ideas, maybe before this whole process, that you thought were something that you potentially wanted to get into as well, or no?
I've always got ideas. Yes. I think, like I told you earlier, everything you say yes to, you're saying no to something else. And so the biggest learning that I've had in the last 2 or 3 years is focus. The difference between a laser and a light bulb is focus. And so, yes, I have ideas, and yes, I write them down in the back of my head, but I'm staying locked in on socks because I don't want to divert my attention to something else. This is what we're focused on now. This is what we're going to blow up. This is how we're going to help people. And then once we cross the finish line, wherever that may be, that's when we can divert our attention elsewhere.
Love that. That's exactly the mindset you got to have, man. To me, it sounds like you got it all down. It's just a time variable factor now because you're putting in all the effort that you should be. And kudos to you. It's honestly impressive to listen to and to hear your story. One last question I want to ask you here, Matthew. What's the most influential book you've ever read? This could be any range of topics, but not just the best, but really the most influential book that really hit you the hardest.
I think there's three. So first one would be Rich Dad Poor Dad. In high school, I had this. I didn't fully understand the idea of entrepreneurship. To me, that was too far out there. You had to rely fully on yourself, right? I played a team sport, so I was expecting a team. I was used to corporate. My dad worked in corporate, and so I thought that's the way you did it. I thought you worked hard. I thought you worked your butt off in corporate, and then you became that CEO. So that was my idea. How do I become a leader? And so Rich Dad Poor Dad completely changed my mind, completely opened my thought processes. And I almost didn't want to go to college after reading that book, because you hear the poor dad who's highly educated, he has his PhD, but he can't rub two pennies together. And then you hear the rich dad who dropped out of high school and he's running the island of Hawaii. So I would highly encourage anybody to start with that book. The foundations in there are incredible. Number two, How to Win Friends and Influence People. My biggest learning in there is you can learn something from anybody. And I think that really helped me to relate to people. So many people say they struggle making friends. I don't care where I am in the world. I don't care who you are. You can relate to somebody on anything. And relating to people is the number one way to, create friends, build relationships. And so that's another fantastic book. I'm going to be rereading that soon. I highly encourage anybody to read that. And then third is The Power of the Subconscious Mind. And it's the idea of constantly having your subconscious stew on positive thinking, and it's almost creating luck for yourself. And a quick example of that is I told you guys that I had gotten diagnosed with celiac and I wasn't able to eat gluten. And part of that book is talking about healing yourself naturally and using your subconscious mind to do it. And so you have your conscious mind that's in thought. I'm talking right now. I'm thinking and formulating what I'm going to be saying. Your subconscious mind is what is pumping your heart. And so if you can tap into that and, your breath and all these different things, if you tap into your subconscious mind, you're not consciously thinking, but you're subconsciously thinking on it. So you can heal yourself. And there's stories in that book of people with stage 4 cancer. They're about to die. They tap into their subconscious mind and they reverse it and they heal themselves. And so I started using some of the principles in that book and told myself I was healthy, told myself I could eat gluten. And believe it or not, I completely reversed celiac, started eating gluten. And that's just another story for another day. But I started eating gluten again. I was on a trip with some buddies. I had eaten a whole bowl full of pasta I didn't know was not gluten-free. It had the leaf on there, so I assumed that was gluten-free, but it ended up being vegetarian. And so I got that hot feeling over me. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get sick. And I didn't. And so I went into the doctor to test my blood to see where my gluten levels were at. And it was way below where it was, like well in the range of normal. And they're like, man, you're doing fantastic. And I said, well, doc, I got to tell you something. I've been eating gluten. And he was just shocked. He couldn't believe it. He said, I've never seen this before. And so if you haven't read that book, it's applicable to anything. The Power of the Subconscious Mind is an incredible read.
Awesome. I love when I get new book recommendations. I do think there is such a thing as, potentially overreading books. That's something that I think Alex Hormozi talks about. You don't just want to, only read books or only watch YouTube tutorials, but then never actually implement or never actually apply any of those concepts. So I don't recommend getting in the habit of doing that, but there's a ton you can learn from books and YouTube tutorials if you use them the right way and go about them the right way. So I will have to add The Power of the Subconscious Mind. I also love Rich Dad Poor Dad, and I just finished reading How to Win Friends and Influence People, but I have not read that one, that third one. So I will definitely get on that and let you know what I think of it. Matthew, this was super fun, super insightful into kind of how your mind works and how you run your business. And I am wishing you nothing but the best going forward with it. And I really think you're going to be successful going forward with it, because hearing you, your story, and just how your mindset is and what you want to accomplish in this life, I think you got all the values right. I think your character's on point and you're going to do great things. So thank you very much for coming on the episode, Matthew.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate you having me. This was awesome.